International trade is very important for the development of economies and for our day-to-day. If we do not exploit comparative advantages, if we do not specialize in what we do well, countries that are more isolationist are going to do less well. And the European Union is a very good example of how far economies can integrate to generate more value. The retired people of the United Kingdom yesterday decided to take the economy in which they no longer work outside of the integrated market. And that will reduce the value of the companies that operate there and their desire to operate there. It's going to reduce the value of the output of the workers there and what they get paid for that output. And therefore it's going to be very bad news, especially for the British economy. For the European economy, it's a slightly lesser problem because the European countries still have each other. And by having each other, that means that they are losing only a part of the integrated market, not the entire integrated market. But the British economy is not a small part of that integrated economy, and therefore this is also a significant loss for them. When economies lose value, when companies lose value, when people can expect to lose jobs and lose productivity, the entire world gets affected because we are all each other's clients and each other's providers. And therefore, even though the output effect of this, the production effect of this, say in the Americas and in particular in Latin America, are going to be significantly smaller, it is also not a good news and certainly not something that we're indifferent about. And it might affect us even if marginally compared to the effect that happens in Europe. The size of the problem and the implications largely depend on how things proceed. What has to happen now is that Britain has to invoke Chapter 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon, which means that they're leaving. Chapter 50 can be implemented in 1 second if the country simply leaves, abandons all expectation of a special treatment with the European Union, and ceases giving the European Union any special treatment. In that case, it's a very simple process in which each of them simply abide as members of the World Trade Organization towards each other. But obviously, doing it like this would be particularly devastating because a lot of British people work in activities that make sense because Britain is part of the European Union and because a lot of their trade in both directions is going to be impeded. And that is why Chapter 50 of the treaty allows for a negotiation to take no longer than 2 years, in which Britain and Europe can answer the question, if we're no longer going to be part of the same integrated market, but at the same time we do not want to have simply the relationship we have with everybody else, where in the middle do we put the relationship? If in those negotiations Britain displays significant interest in keeping alive a lot of what has value, and Europe finds itself yielding to that, then the implications of Brexit could be smaller for Britain, smaller for Europe, and smaller for the world. If, on the other hand, an agreement cannot be reached, or in particular, if that negotiation ends up manifesting a desire from either side to move away from the other, then the implications could be much larger. And it is up to what happens in the next 2 years, more or less, to figure out in which size of a Brexit we're talking about. Are we talking about a separation, no longer a membership, but still a very special relationship? Or are we talking about a more drastic separation that could make Britain, even from the point of view of the European Union, like any other WTO member, like for example Japan or the United States? The first part of the current arrangement that could fall now that Brexit has happened, that Britain has decided to leave the European Union, is the status of Scotland. Not only there is a significant independence movement in Scotland that led very recently to a vote over whether to stay in the United Kingdom or to leave, But two other things happened. First of all, a very important argument in the decision to stay that the Scottish took then was the threat that if they left Britain, they would be out of the European Union. Scots did not want to happen, were afraid of being left out, and therefore that was one of the reasons why many Scots voted to stay. Ironically, yesterday the Scots voted to stay again. They voted to stay in the European Union, and it was the rest of the United Kingdom that voted to leave. So it is not out of the question, actually not surprising given the statements that have been put out even on the first day after Brexit, that the Scottish government is going to say, well, this has fundamentally changed circumstances, and if staying in Britain means that we leave the European Union, we may want to rethink staying in Britain or not. And my impression is that even though the margin of that vote a few months ago was actually quite significant in favor of staying in Britain, that what happened yesterday may very dramatically change that outcome. And in particular, that now it would be feasible for things to split further. In that event, the United Kingdom not only would be losing membership to the European Union, but it would also be losing the most significant of their non-English territories, right? The second biggest part of the kingdom. And that would have further ramifications on their economy, and perhaps also on the economy of the rest of the world. One has to wonder also, especially if the negotiations between Britain and Europe end up being fairly friendly. If other countries are not going to consider that the quasi-membership that can be achieved by first quitting and then negotiating some kind of special deal is not preferable to them to the full membership. We have already seen in 3 European countries that their own anti-Europe movements have decided to ask for a vote on the same question. And even though one can predict in those countries that today the outcome of a vote of that nature would be to stay in Europe, if the path that Britain and the European Union end up taking is one that is very amicable, it might be that those balances change in those nations. This, on the other hand, is a reason to expect that the European Union is going to want to be particularly tough in those negotiations, which may mean that the economic damage provoked is even larger. The world trading system is based on a general, not very deep, but very comprehensive in terms of the number of countries, agreement, which has got the basis of the WTO. Everybody here is staying there because neither Britain nor the European Union cease to be members. So, if the relationship between them ceased to be special, it would simply be the relationship called most favored nation that countries in WTO give to each other, and that is still a relationship that gives each of them rights and obligations before the other. Now, the world trading system is also composed of bilateral deals, like agreements, free trade agreements that countries may have with each other, and some significant regional deals like the European Union that integrates even more deeply different economies that happen to be neighbors to each other. Right now, we are in the midst of the early stages, perhaps not so early, of very significant negotiations. One involving North American partners, the partners of the North American Free Trade Agreement, negotiating a free trade deal with a series of countries across the Pacific, and another one negotiating across the Atlantic with the European Union. For the United States, to some extent also for Canada, the United Kingdom is a very important part for the European Union for reasons that go beyond economics. And I would not be surprised, especially if the negotiations between the Brits and the Europeans drag along, that this would provoke a certain delay in the cross-Atlantic negotiations, perhaps even a complete derailment. And that the focus of North Americans is going to be more on the alliance across the Pacific with Asian nations than across the Atlantic with the European nations. Latin America is very dependent of trade. In the case of South America, the most commodity-rich region in the world, Obviously, those commodities are produced largely to be exported, and the volume and value of those exports depend on the health of the world economy. The United Kingdom is not a negligible part of that world economy, and the European Union is actually the largest partner in that world economy. Therefore, for South America, an exporter of commodities, it could be a fairly bad effect to have a large recession in the United Kingdom, a smaller deceleration, maybe even a recession in the European Union, and some kind of impact in the growth rates of the rest of the world. In the case of the northern part of Latin America, Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, that is not a region that is rich in commodities, but on the other hand, is a region that exports very significantly services, including but not limiting themselves to tourism, and manufacturing goods. And therefore, this is also an economy that depends not only on the health of the global economy, but also on the ability to co-produce with the world economy, to integrate into complex value chains, right? To be able to move things back and forth in the process of producing complex goods. The European Union's companies are going to need to rethink how they organize their production now that they cannot feel that the European Union is part of them. And in that rethinking of the production, the co-production with other regions of the world is going to be affected. In addition to this, the European Union also has a very significant demonstration effect. Central America, for example, has an agreement between the countries that existed more or less since the 1950s, at more or less the same time as the European treaties have existed, and that has been gradually integrating the economies of these 5 countries in the same way that Europe integrated each other, and expanding into other newer countries like Panama or countries in the Caribbean, also in the way in which the European Union expanded. A derailment in the European process may reverberate not only economically but also politically in the decision-making process in the case of Central America. In the rest of Latin America, there's other agreements, Mercosur in the deep south, CARICOM in the Caribbean, that also try to do some degree of regional integration, and to some extent are also trying to emulate European example. Now, in those cases, the integration is lesser than the Central American case, and much lesser than in Europe. But again, the pace at which these countries integrate will also be affected by the first significant derailment that the integration process in Europe suffers. The agreements that these countries have, many countries have, with the European Union are going to still be valid the day after Brexit comes to a conclusion. But those agreements are no longer going to include the United Kingdom. In other words, if the country that you happen to be in is a country that trades intensively and freely with the European Union, because an agreement between the European Union and your country is in place, chances are what is going to happen is not going to affect the relationship between your country and the other 27 members of the European Union. However, one of the things that has to happen in the next few years is that the United Kingdom has to decide to what extent and how to establish its own relationships, its own links with those other countries. I have the impression that there is a number of countries that are going to simply agree with the United Kingdom to celebrate an agreement of their own that emulates very significantly, perhaps even is identical to the standing agreement that they have with them through the European Union. And that would be perhaps an easier step, although a step that still has to be taken and passed through the parliaments of both sides, which is always a time-consuming and difficult process. At the same time, it might be that some countries may want to take this opportunity to change the nature of their relationship with the United Kingdom, making it different from the one that they have with the European Union. And that is going to be a more complex case in which also the British are going to be flooded by the need to perform a large number of negotiations in a brief period of time without the support of the very significant negotiating branch that the European Union has in Brussels. And that has to be as something that puts in risk the special relation, the special access that British goods have to third markets and third markets goods have to the British consumers.